At your tables, you have your red folders, and you have a couple of handouts for this class. There will be no PowerPoints, so just kind of relax a little bit. I think Charity kind of ramped us up enough that we don't need to do PowerPoints. You are all ready to engage. So we're going to process a little bit more interactive style with you today. And look at that, the chairs are coming. This is like a family meeting right here. So I don't have any announcements that I can think of other than we only have 2 classes after this and then the decision forward of intermediate or other pathway. So if you weren't here last week, what I'd like you to do is when we have this last week I did a teaching on vision and strategy. It was very specific about what intermediate class would look like and how the restoration ministry is designed to have Thursday night sessions. And I kind of really explored that so that people can make an informed decision. They did it within a community, though, at their table. If you weren't here, I'm speaking to you. So what you missed was the call to community to have a conversation about it. Before we simply checked off the boxes about what we're going to do next. So even though there's a handout for you that we want you to have today to take home, please don't hurry through that just to check boxes off on the front and the back. I would hope that by the end of the month you'll have an opportunity to then watch last week's class. I'll send a link to it as soon as we get it up on our website, and I'll send a link to you so that you can actually watch it. And then I would actually ask someone who knows you, maybe next week when you're in class, maybe you can have a conversation about it, maybe you can have a conversation outside of class, but bring it into community before you check off the boxes and let people speak over you, know you. And then from that place, hand it in to your table facilitator or to Mike and I or Anna. And from there, we will be going forward. So again, that's the survey. If you didn't get it last week, we hand it out to you today. But don't fill it out so quickly. Okay. Well, let me just pray and then turn it over to our distinguished speakers, people that I care about very. Jerry, I really like you. And you really are amazing. Yeah, you have a passion, call, and you are surrounded by very good people like the Bird family. So, and Mike, I have to admit, I really like you. So, Father God, we just thank you that that by your Spirit you make us so likable. We know that you love us, but we also know that you like us, and so we're grateful today for that. We just ask that your presence will be manifest today in our speakers, that their life of pursuing after you and being compassionate, wounded healers to others will be an anointing and an impartation today over all of us. So we are grateful for what you're going to do. We are eagerly anticipating you to show up in a very mighty way through willing vessels. And from that place, we know that they will be blessed and they will be a blessing. And we will be blessed, and we hope that we more can be a blessing to others. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so enjoy class today.
I was wondering what Jeff was going to say after he introduced Charity with such warm affection. But anyhow, we want to share a little bit, first of all, about how we relate together and how we met. And we expect that this morning is going to be just highly interactive. We're not overly prepared. We both felt that we wanted to share more from our hearts and from our experience, and then also be able to experience with you some answers and some thoughts and some questions that you may have. So let me just start with how we met. It actually is a chain of people that is fairly unique. My wife, Jan, her prayer partner at the University of Missouri decades ago was Ame Seymour. And Ame and Lane had 3 children, the oldest of which was Amber. Our son, who was in the back with his wife, Amy, our son Brad, in the bright yellow jacket back there, doesn't he look sharp? He and Amber sort of grew up together with the other children. We visited out Missouri. They came to Colorado to visit us many times. And Jan and Ame stay connected still through prayer and through just sharing. Amber and Charity have known each other for 14 years.
We were prayer partners at Northwest Missouri State.
Then why don't you tell them how we met and what our relationship is like?
Sure. I have been friends. Amber is my best friend. We've been friends for about 14 years, and she decided about 7 years ago that she was going to move to Colorado Springs. And she had some family friends in the area, so she knew that she would have some support and connection out there. She had gotten her degree in nursing, and she's now an ER nurse. And when I was looking at getting my master's in counseling, I'd been working in a psychiatric hospital for about 6 years and knew that I wanted to go to a Christian school to get my master's in counseling because I knew that that was the way that I wanted to go. And when I did that, I looked at Colorado Springs because my best friend was having to move to Colorado Springs. And when I moved out to Colorado Springs, obviously me and Amber moved in together, and she had a built-in family support system when she moved out, and so I was obviously included in that support system. So through that, I actually got to meet all of the Bird family, and they also took me in under their wings as Amber being a second daughter to them. I kind of got just pulled into that loop as well.
I can't hug Charity enough. She's like a daughter. We've been able to work together at Wings of Grace. She has an amazing skill set. I have like total confidence in Charity. I can send anybody to her. It's just wonderful to know that she's around. I remember one of the first meetings we had took place actually out in the coffee shop out there. Charity, and she shared her story, I think, with you a couple of weeks ago, was working her way through a very difficult, abusive relationship, and we got to be a part of helping her with that. So I have strong feelings of affection for Charity. I like to sense that in some way I'm able to be a covering for her in an appropriate way. I just love Charity.
When I was going through my master's program, part of the master's program was doing a 700-hour internship. And of course, when I was looking at doing an internship, I'm like, I have a family friend that owns a counseling organization. I am going to go to him and see if he'll take me on. And so I kind of went up to Mike and I'm like, would you be willing to have an intern at Wings of Grace? And he prayed about it and accepted me. And I did my internship at Wings of Grace, and then I stayed on here for about 5 years now.
It's been a marvelous relationship. So we want to share this morning and just build on what Charity was sharing before. So she's going to begin by sharing some statistics, and then we're going to go into one of your handouts, actually two of your handouts, on the power control wheel and the healthy relationship wheel, and we'll do some feedback back and forth. And then we'll have probably a group question and answer period later on.
So just to begin with, one of the things that I really thought that I wanted to emphasize this week, I kind of looked at some of the things that I talked about a couple weeks ago, and in all honesty, I could go on for hours and hours, and there's so much material there that I did DP 101 for you guys. There is so many layers and so much depth to the work that can be done with domestic violence, sexual assault, and healthy families. But one of the things that I thought that I would really emphasize with you guys today to kind of paint a broader picture around this is to let you know that one thing that is constantly, that the church is familiar with, something that we're constantly hearing is that we need community. And I would tell you that in a professional in the field, as there's so much research coming out about healthy relationships, how trauma impacts the brain, how societies are functioning, we're looking at mental health issues, we're looking at drug and alcohol abuse, we're looking at sexual abuse, and the thing that keeps coming back as the core of everything is relationships. Relationships are absolutely the core, fundamental ingredient that we need to be healthy. And what is happening in our society is with our modern technology and all those types of things, over the last couple hundred years, we have less and less community. And it's, again, the way our society is built, designed, our modern conveniences, our modern technology, there's more and more isolation, and there's less and less meaningful community connection. And we're obviously seeing that in just statistic-wise with the younger generation, teenagers now, what we're seeing is we've actually had a 60% increase in the juvenile justice system with teenagers in the last 5 years. Our suicide rate for teenagers went from 6% 10 years ago to now being 15%. And actually Colorado has one of the highest suicide rates in the nation. And what we also know is that right now we have 25% of families that are at risk. What we know is that those at-risk families, the increase in drug and alcohol abuse, the increase in mental illness, the increase in physical illness, one thing is that it's draining our systems. I actually, kind of funny, I was at a behavioral health summit a couple weeks ago, and like right after I did the presentation here, and there's this whole group, I'm meeting with the CEOs of Memorial Health System, Penrose, Cedar Springs. It's all these major organizations that are trying to deal with the mental health crisis. And I'm sitting at a table with a big group of people. There's probably 100 people here talking about how we're going to deal with the mental health crisis in our community. And there's this huge outcry from all of the groups saying, where's the faith-based community? Where is the churches? Aren't they supposed to care about people? Where are they? There's nobody here. And I was sitting at a table when that was being put out there, presented, and I just said, you know what, I actually happen to be a part of the faith-based community, and I actually just taught a class, a lay counseling ministry class, last weekend, and there's over 100 people that are willing to get involved. And just the people's reaction to that was, oh my gosh, that is so needed, where are they right now? So our community, El Paso community, is crying out for relationships. Here's the other scary statistics. This was done by Bruce Perry, who is the leading expert on how trauma impacts the brain. And with the rising statistics of violence right now, 70% of teenagers are exposed to violence. So even if you have a healthy family and you're trying to grow your teenagers and your children to be healthy adults, they're also being exposed to teen dating violence. They're being exposed to violence in their high schools. 70% of teenagers have experienced some type of abusive relationship. Only 10% of parents are actually talking to their teenagers about what a healthy relationship is. And what we're finding with the numbers and the statistics is that by 2030, we're going to have 60% of our families at-risk families, which means 60% of our population is going to be struggling with mental health issues, with drug and alcohol abuse, with physical illness, with suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, and it's going to overwhelm our community. These are scary statistics. But I also believe that as the church, we have the answer. We know that the answer is community, but it's purposeful community. It's a community where there is love, and we know that that only comes through Jesus Christ. And so we have a unique role in the church to be that community, And just working at Tessa, I can tell you, I'm majorly involved with CSPD, with the DA's office, with the judicial systems, with the school districts. They are crying out for the church to come and step in and help because they're completely overwhelmed by the violence that is happening in the school systems, in the homes, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't have the answers.
Sherry, the last time you spoke, you gave us statistics for Colorado Springs and Orland. Could you share that again? Because it was really hot. I was shocked.
The statistics of exposure to domestic violence? 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 6 men are exposed to some type of abuse. 1 out of 4 is physical violence in a domestic violence relationship. And the statistics are the same in the church as they are outside of the church.
So let me relate that to the church for a moment, because Charity's representing that part of our culture that she works in. But the problem is as significant in the church as it is outside of the church. So I'm going to make this statement. Keep in mind some words that are very important, because the church has been very clever at covering domestic violence and abuse by using words like headship, by using words like shepherding, by using words like intense discipleship, and of course the word submission. So submission is a general teaching of the church, and as a general teaching of the church, has been used as a mantle to cover up sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual, and verbal abuse. I can remember now almost 40 years ago, because I was a pastor for nearly 20 years, about 18 years. There were times in those first 10 years of pastoring, we were under some very bad teaching that had a lot to do with headship, discipleship, shepherding, and those terms were used to really control people. And I can recall situations where being with senior pastor leadership, things like sexual abuse were covered up because the man would say, "I'll never do it again." And based on his word, it was dismissed. It was told to the wife and to the children, "This will never happen again. Trust us." But from experience, knowing that it continued to happen and wasn't reported, even in those days, 35, 40 years ago, it was not required for pastoral staffs to report. Now, based on a moral conviction as well as a legal conviction, an ethical conviction, those things are being reported, and the church is doing something. But abuse is just as prevalent, just as big of a problem in the church as outside of the church.
I did want to share a little bit too that I didn't get a chance to go into a little bit last week. I obviously know that as me and Mike are presenting, this information can be pretty overwhelming. And I know that, we can see the problem and then talking about how to put some action steps to it, which is actually what we're going to do later today, is kind of break the guys apart into groups and just talk about what are some action steps that we can begin to take. I honestly believe the first action step is education. In all honesty, and that's kind of where I feel God's calling has been placed upon me is to begin educating the church and the community as much as possible about how dangerous this is and what our future is going to look like if, as a church and as a body, we don't start addressing it and trying to do something about it. Because the 2030 statistics are very staggering to me. But one that I wanted to share with you guys a little bit today is some of the things that we actually do at TESA, because I know that some of this information, if you're functioning in a lay counseling capacity, I want you to know that we're not expecting you or wanting you to address the issues of domestic violence, severe physical abuse in the home by yourself, because we don't do that at TESA. We actually have what's called a divert program, where whenever there's a domestic violence situation, and I run 6 different programs at TESA. I run the children's program, which includes all of our domestic violence education to teenagers, children. It includes individual therapy, play therapy, parent coaching, all those things with our children and our families at TESA. I work with our advocacy department, which is involved with CSPD and the DA's office, where we are connecting women to the resources that they need legally if they're in a situation where they're trying to flee an abusive situation. We help them with protection orders, help them with connecting to CSPD, filing reports and all those things, and then actually walking with them through the court process, because oftentimes victims have no idea what they need or what to do in the court process when they're trying to prosecute for domestic violence. I also run our rural program. We have offices in Teller County, Woodland Park, and so some of the rural communities, we actually have advocates that we're sending out and we're connecting to the rural areas as well. I run our internship program, and then we also have our safe house. I'm actually not the manager for the safe house, but I coordinate with helping manage that as well. But one of the things that we do when we have a domestic violence situation is we are connecting with all of our community and we're addressing it as a team. We do not ever go out to a house where there's domestic violence by ourselves. If we're going out to a house, we're going with a police officer, we're going with a victim advocate from the police department, we're coming with us as a victim advocate, we're coming with DHS if there is children in the home, and then we've also already talked to the DA and we've also got an attorney involved in the process. We also work with Judge Miles, who runs the DV court in the 4th Judicial District, and he actually, we have an offender treatment provider, myself, and then we also have all the attorneys involved and all that stuff when we're actually working through getting him healing. So he's held accountable by the courts. We also work with probation. So I want to let you guys know that this is a complex issue, and we are not wanting you to try to take this on by yourself. If we're going to address domestic violence in the church, it's not a one-man show. It definitely is having to come alongside the community, and it's also coming alongside with a team of people to address some of these issues because they are serious.
So let's think hypothetically for a moment or two. It's likely that as a lay counselor, even as a prayer counselor up front at the altar, that you can encounter a situation in which you would either suspicion or you would be told about abuse that's taking place. Under the guidelines that we have to operate, we have a legal and an ethical obligation to report. We have to do that because that's part of our licensure process. With children, we report to the Department of Human Services. I think the moral obligation is even greater than the legal and the legal and ethical constraint. But if someone were to come to you, and this is the process we take, I love to tell people when they disclose those kinds of things that it's better if they self-report. However, if they make the choice to self-report, I always ask them, call them later on, ask the name of the person they reported to at DHS, and then I follow up with a call to make sure that that report has happened. Because people will say they will do one thing and won't. In the same way, I would think the protocol would be that if you were exposed to something like that, if you were told about something like that, your mind, because you're not under the same legal and ethical restraints, but the moral restraint you are, you would then go to Jeff or Mike or a pastoral person and either make the connection with them or ask those people to self-report to the staff and then follow up to make sure that that actually has taken place. Any questions about that? Any thoughts about that? We want to be able to entertain questions as they come as well. But back here.
Are you referring to just physical, or are you referring to reporting emotional, verbal? I mean, at what point do you report?
Could you repeat that for us?
Yeah, the question is, are we referring to only physical violence, or are we referring to other kinds of violence? Certainly physical violence and sexual violence are issues that I think are mandatory. In terms of verbal, emotional, you need to know that you want to make a connection with those people where they're getting ongoing help and ongoing counsel. If that's you or if that's a staff member, I just think the connection needs to be made.
Is there concern at all or much pattern of false reporting in terms of a spiteful thing and how do you just
The statistics,
What was that question?
the question was, is there issues with false reporting? The statistics are about 6% are false reporting. So in all likelihood, you're probably dealing with a true report. Now, one of the biggest issues that the court system actually has with domestic violence is recantation. Victim recantation is about 75%. So this is a situation where a victim is physically abused. They decide that they call the police come, he's arrested, the DA is working with her to go to court, and she'll get into the court and stand before the judge and say, he didn't hit me. This happens about 70 to 75% of the time. Some of the reasons for that, though, is oftentimes if you have an abusive situation, it is seldom just inside the home. Oftentimes there's people in his life that are also helping the abuse happen as well. Sometimes it's his family, sometimes it's his friends. And so he can look at her, and this is one of the things that we're working with CSPD, is they're actually starting to monitor some of the phone calls from the jail, because what is happening is these offenders are calling the victims and basically saying, you know who is going to come after you and kill you if you report to me in the court. And so she's getting before the judge and saying, nothing happened. But he's got other avenues where he is threatening her, and he can threaten her from jail. So right now, CSPD is working on how to minimize that and actually reporting phone calls of offenders calling their abuser or their victim from jail. So and then there's just the piece that sometimes, they really love the person and they feel guilty for holding him accountable, responsible, and after the physical abuse has ended, they want the relationship back. So again, there's a lot of victim recantation, which can cause people to think that there is false reporting. So the false reporting is kind of blown up because of the victim recantation. False reporting does happen, and it is about 6% of the time. In my opinion, that's a very low statistic compared to the actuality of abuse happening.
However, when it does happen, in terms of a counseling situation, the false report normally doesn't come out unless that couple or those people are staying in counseling for a period of time. As they work through their own process, that's when we become aware of that. However, false reporting is not our responsibility or your responsibility to disentangle. In other words, we aren't detectives, we aren't investigators in that sense, and we don't go down that road. It's up to other authority figures to figure out if there's been a false report. And then also, it is true, I just had a situation a few weeks ago where men are physically assaulted as well. This isn't just a woman's issue. And it's a growing problem as well, as violence is portrayed through all kinds of media and technology. And as we've grown accustomed to it and sort of been acclimated to it, there are more and more situations of men being physically assaulted.
The statistics are about 1 in 17 are male victims.
So we want to share one of your handouts, the healthy relationship wheel and the power and control wheel, and go through that fairly quickly and maybe use a few illustrations to let you know what our thoughts are about this. Charity's going to do the power and control wheel. I'm going to do the healthy relationship wheel. And they don't exactly correspond. Each slice of this pie doesn't match and go according to a coordinated effort, so some of the topics change. Would you like to start?
Sure. The first one that we'll start with is emotional abuse. And this is something that we kind of talked about a couple weeks ago. But what emotional abuse looks like is when one partner is putting down the other partner in a way that makes that person feel bad about themselves. So it could be even just that situation where someone feels like their ideas, their voice, their opinions, it never matters in a relationship where there's domestic violence. So one partner can ask the other partner, where would you like to go to eat? And that person is basically saying, I want to go to Applebee's. And the partner, the abusive partner, that's so stupid. Why would you even want to go someplace like that? Don't you know that their service is horrible, yada, yada, yada. So anytime that person, I'm going to use male, she and he, because it gets too complicated for me. But let's say, for example, she is the victim and the male is the offender. It's one of those situations where he's constantly making her feel like her ideas and her opinions and what she thinks is ridiculous or stupid or how could she even think that way. It also is, he is making her feel responsible for his moods. He is basically placing all of his moods on her. When you do that, it makes me so angry. When you do this, it makes me so happy. And it is all about power and control. It's all about making her responsible for how he feels and what he does. And so, again, as we move into the wheel, we'll look at what that looks like when it turns to physical violence. But the emotional piece of it is basically making her responsible for his feelings, for his behaviors. She is the cause of all of it. And in that is there's a significant amount of emotional abuse where he is putting her down and making her feel inferior as if she is an object in the possession and not an equal partner in the relationship.
I want to make sure that all of you, that you have 4 wheels in front of you, because I see some using the larger wheel. Do you have all 4 wheels? Okay, just want to make sure. And we're going,
Just let you know that we have the healthy wheel on blue paper.
oh, okay.
And we have what you're doing right now on the
So blue is for boys. Boys are healthy. So we're going clockwise. My first section is appropriate touching. Valuing through non-sexual hugs, the ability to express the need to be touched, the frequency and the extent. Interesting about this has been around for a long time. If you discipline children, for instance, with your hand, then you go to hug them, what do they know to expect? In the same way, when there's been physical violence and inappropriate touching, how does the person who's receiving it know which direction you're coming in? for correction and for violence, or for hugging and for embracing. Also, too, long-standing problem. 35 years ago, a book was written by Kevin Lehman called Sex Begins in the Kitchen. What was the purpose of the book? The purpose of the book was to say sex is a great activity among married couples. However, so often touching is inappropriate because very frequently what I hear women saying is that I don't know when my husband touches me what he's there for. Is it truly for just affection, or is it something that's supposed to lead to something else? And there's a lack of clarity with that kind of touching. So being direct, expressing what you truly want, need, and desire to the extent and the frequency is extremely important in a married relationship, or in any relationship.
Something that I want to emphasize too, as we're going through these wheels, these are patterns of behavior and relationships. So whether it's the healthy relationship wheel or the power and control wheel, you want to make sure that when you're looking at a relationship that it's holistic. So what you're finding in these relationships is there's multiple different things. It can be just one thing that's happening in a relationship, or it can be all these things on the spoke. So I just want to emphasize that too, that in the healthy relationships, you're hoping that the relationship that has all of those. In the power and control, again, you're looking for, even if there's just one, you're looking at domestic violence tendencies, but in general, you're looking at a pattern of behavior that fits across multiple parts of this wheel, this area. The second one is threats. So this is basically where the abuser is constantly threatening their partner. And that can look several different ways. There can be the physical threats, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to hurt our children. Oftentimes there is for example, it can be an unspoken threat. For example, if the abuser takes a gun and just places it on the edge of the table, doesn't have to say anything, doesn't have to do anything, it's just a spoken, I have the ability to hurt you, and I have the means to hurt you, and it's just a simple gesture. Oftentimes what you'll find is that abusers will use a look to communicate that there is a threat involved. So when their victim is not acting or responding the way that abuser wants them to, they will give them that look, and that victim knows when you see that look that something bad is happening or something bad is going to happen. This can also look like the abuser will threaten suicide, will threaten to ruin the victim's reputation. This happens very frequently in high school dating relationships, where the abusive partner will tell them, I will destroy your reputation, I'll tell everybody that you're a slut, you're a whore, you're this, I will make sure that no guy will ever touch you again, and they'll use threats like that to diminish their reputation, their social status. This is most frequently used in high school relationships, but it also is in adult relationships. So it can be emotional threats to take the children. And something I do want to point out too, just so you guys know, I'll get on this when we do the children too, but 60 to 70% of the time, if there is a custody battle, the abuser gets the children. So when he threatens that if you leave me, I will make sure you never see your children again, sometimes that threat is very real.
My second category is proper bonding. Emotional support, a composite of two perceptions allowing for individuality, yet creating a new entity called we. And I like to use the simple illustration. Relationships were never really intended to be like this, two people totally separated. But relationships were never really intended to be like this, one on top of the other, where there is no individuality. It's some combination of intersection that takes place that respects the individuality of one another. For instance, Jan and I are very opposite in a lot of ways, and how we come to decisions, it can be very, very different. We just went through the purchase of a car this last week, and in that struggle of what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, are we going to finance it, are we going to pay for it in cash, it's a give and take process for us. I would do things a certain way, and she would do things a different way. But the blending of that, a great illustration of that was that on Tuesday or Wednesday, the dealership wanted us to come down and close the deal that night. And that was the night actually we were supposed to meet with charity and discuss what we were doing this morning. And so then the guy was trying to work it out so we could find an hour to squeeze it in. If it couldn't happen then, could it happen the next day? And finally Jan said in bed one morning, why don't you just test the whole thing? Tell him you can't be there until Friday, and he'll just have to deal with it. I really wanted to get it finished, but I said, hey, that's a reasonable idea. So we did that. We didn't close it until yesterday. So it's a true give and take process, entertaining the fact that both of us have a mind, both of us have a heart, both of us have a desire, and a certain way we like to see things happen.
The next one is the economic abuse. Again, what is often vital for an abuser with their victim is to make sure that she does not have the means that she needs to leave the relationship. His primary goal is to make sure that she is controlled, that she is not going to leave the relationship. One of his biggest fears is abandonment and rejection. So the best way that he can to try to isolate her, either from keeping her from working altogether, keeping her from having money, and then also keeping her from access to money. Because if she has access to means, then she has the potential to get away from the relationship. And so again, he will systematically try to make sure that she has no means. He's the one that controls the bills. He tells her what she can spend. He will typically give her a certain dollar amount. If she does the grocery shopping, he will give her a certain dollar amount, and if she gets something extra for the kids or something like that, that'll typically turn into an abusive situation where she disobeyed him and did not do what he demanded and told her to do. So again, he is typically in charge of the money, typically in control of the finances. And again, it's different from a relationship where maybe the husband is a better accountant, and it's different from him, I'm going to manage the finances because I'm better at it, versus I'm going to do it to make sure that I can control you and that you don't have means to get away from this relationship or to have a mind of your own.
Mine is economic cooperation, mutual consent for major spending, open communication on all financial matters, great or small. Probably in terms of our relationship, and I will continue to refer to that because it's so easy. That's been one of the easier areas of our marriage, financial cooperation. Years ago, we set up a structure that I like to pass on to other people, where each month, Jan gets a certain amount of money that she doesn't have to account for. And I get a certain amount of money I don't have to account for. And I know pretty much what Jan does with her money. I know she gives most of it away, because she's a very, very generous person. In fact, Jan would probably give everything away if she had her way. I'm not that way, so if you're looking for some investment in your ministry, you probably should talk to Jan. But we're also very generous at the same time. But we made a conclusion years and years ago that we would never make any large financial decisions without agreeing together that that's what we wanted to do. And it's worked well, served well. Doesn't mean that there aren't times where there'll be some stress about finances. Obviously, finances are a major area, but cooperation is at the top of the charts. And I remember years ago, before I married Jan, her father's words to me, where Jan was working 2 jobs, I think, at the time, and he told me, she gives away everything she makes. You better be able to take care of her. But, we've had to work that out throughout our marriage and cooperate.
Intimidation is the next one on the power and control wheel. And this is basically where he's using the looks, the actions, the gestures, the loud voice, the cursing, and the continual arguing. And basically his goal is to make her fearful. That is the goal of the intimidation, is to make sure that she is afraid and so that she doesn't try to leave the relationship. So he will use, again, like I said before, that they will typically use the minimum amount of what is needed to keep that person under control, and they will up the ante as the situation demands it. If she starts to rebel against the emotional abuse or the verbal abuse, that is when the intimidation will begin to increase. So if she's basically being told that your opinions don't matter and she decides that she wants to fight that, that is when he'll typically use intimidation to try to get her back down where she belongs, in his opinion. That she's trying to come up and be an equal, and he will use intimidation to push her back down to make sure that she's fearful of what he can do, and then oftentimes he will follow through on some of those intimidations and threats to make sure that she knows that he's capable of doing anything that he says he can.
Respect of property, a respect for the relationship, her property, his property, and mutual property, with regard to individual property of each of the children. Very sad thing. I can't tell you the number of times where in my own particular counseling practice, things get destroyed. pictures, albums, clothes, keepsakes, because people get into fights and arguments, into these power and control things, and property gets destroyed, which is just shameful in terms of the longevity of the relationship, if it's going to be sustained. If someone has gotten mad and burned the wedding pictures, they're irreplaceable. And too often those kinds of things happen. And in single wage income families, let's say where the husband is the single wage earner, that can become even more problematic. In other words, in times of tension and disagreement in the relationship, it's my house, it's my money, it's my stuff. And you hear those kinds of phrases over and over, and that does not respect the relationship. Jan happens to drive a Toyota pickup. I like to drive until last Friday night a nice sporty Acura, which was traded in. But I like to hunt and fish. I have to borrow Jan's truck to go do that. And I have to try to make arrangements so that what she does in terms of her hobbies and likes and dislikes, she can actually facilitate when her truck is gone. And that to me is just a respect of property. Trying to understand that there's a his, a hers, and a we, and it all needs to be respected.
So the next one on mine is the property violence. So this is basically when the offender is breaking and destroying keepsakes. It also is abuse of pets too, as well. Oftentimes abusers, because the pet is very close to the victim's heart. Oftentimes the pets are kicked and hit and thrown and all those things in order to keep her under control. To take something that she loves and show that you can damage it. And again, it is that destroying of keepsakes and personal things and things like that that will have an emotional impact on the victim.
Okay, appropriate social behaviors. Acceptable public displays of affection. Checking first before making commitments for both. Being struck. I fail at that point sometimes. Too often I say, oh yeah, we'll be there, we can do that. Being structured and scheduled versus being spontaneous. I happen to not put things on the calendar as frequently as Jan would like me to put them on the calendar, but out of respect, trying to learn over and over to do that more so that she understands what's coming up, when it's coming up. It is just a thing of respect. In terms of public displays of affection, listen, some people are very uncomfortable with that, and some people are more open with that. My take on it is you just have to understand where each person is coming from and be able to respect that.
The silent night, and this is when the person uses silence as a weapon when they refuse to communicate or refuse to talk about or express emotion. I will give an example from my own personal life. This is probably one of the biggest ones that my father used with us as a family. Whenever we would get in the car, we had no idea where we were going, and he would not communicate. So there was always some fear involved of where is he taking us. We would sometimes have no idea. And that was probably one of the biggest weapons my father used in our home growing up, was just that silence. So you never knew what was happening, what was going on. Even when we actually moved, I'm from Bolivar, Missouri. We moved from Bolivar to Kansas City. We didn't know where we were going. So we just knew that we were packing up and moving, and we had no idea where our location was going to be. And Kansas City was where his family was. But again, it was kind of that constant refusing to communicate, refusing to give information that's needed.
Appropriate individuality, the right to personal space, personal interests, activities, decisions, friends, and growth activities, the right to decline dislikes. And I guess what I would say about that whole issue is, I shared with you before, I grew up in a situation with what is best described as a helicopter mom, where space was not respected, where you were not allowed to pull away, where you were not allowed to go to your own bedroom without the door being open, where you were not allowed to have your own interests and likes and dislikes. That obviously can happen within marriage as well, where you get back to that situation where someone is desiring more of this kind of relationship. And the force and the squeeze that goes on that doesn't respect likes and dislikes. For instance, Jan loves gardening for 13 or 14 years. She's been doing volunteer gardening in Glen Eyrie. Gardening was a punishment to me growing up. But I occasionally go out and try and help Jan with her projects out of the way. But it's a separate. She does not go elk hunting with me because there's a separation of likes and dislikes, and I respect that.
The next one is isolation, and this is where the offender is basically controlling who and when and where she goes and who she talks to, who she can be friends with, keep away from family, trying to make sure that she is available to him at all points in time whenever he wants her or needs her, and she better drop anything and everything when he calls and she wants her and needs her. So again, they're oftentimes sabotaging any kind of relationship or support system around the victim to make sure that that person doesn't interfere with that relationship. I can tell you in my home growing up, this was probably a pretty big one. I didn't know that it wasn't normal to not have people over at your house. Like, we never had people over at our house. We didn't have family friends. We didn't have people that came over and did dinner, any of those things. The only time that there was ever an exception, my dad was a Sunday school teacher in the church, and he would have the Sunday school class over to the house, and we were expected to act like we were a very close family. There was an expectation on how as children were supposed to act, like he was the most loving father that we ever had. And my mom was supposed to act the same way. So whenever we would have occasionally the church come over, there was some expectations on how we're supposed to act, but in general, we never had anybody over at our house.
How would your dad communicate that to you? Did he sit you down before people came over and said, I want you to do this?
Nope, it was totally unspoken.
What is she?
Her question was if my dad actually sat down with us beforehand and gave us specific instructions on how we were supposed to behave. No, he did not. He didn't give us that instruction. But there was, if you acted up in any way, shape, or form, there was a punishment, so you knew. And I mean, he made it very, very clear. Like, he was very outgoing and spoken. Like, this is my daughter. She's the love of my life, and those types of things. And if you had a negative emotion or reaction, there was trouble afterward. And so, in all honesty, we learned very early on that you don't.
Okay, respectful request to be able to identify and communicate needs and desires without fear of rejection. I just would take this back and illustrate my own family of origin, where there really wasn't an individuality that was respected. It's like you couldn't pull away from the family system and do something different. Everybody had to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. Part of it is just about control and not respecting the fact that children, as they're growing up, are going to have different desires, different requests, different needs, and to be able to respect those and entertain those is very important.
Using children, so making her feel guilty about the children, using the children as a weapon, using them as messengers. Oftentimes what happens in relationships where there is a lot of domestic violence and power and control is that there actually tends to be a lot of emotional incest. And this is when the children are used to meet the parents' needs. Sometimes it's the offender, and sometimes it's actually the victim. And that was probably definitely the case in our home growing up, is that I'm actually very much a parentified child. I am much more adept at being a parent in my relationship with both of my parents, and still so to this day because of that. But it's oftentimes the parents are turning to the children to meet their emotional needs and meet their needs. And so they will, and actually this is typical from the victim and the offender in this case, because oftentimes the victim, she has so many unmet emotional needs that she's trying to turn to the children for support that she can't turn to her husband for. And oftentimes the victim or the mother in the situation is telling things to the child that the child is too young to hear. I heard all kinds of stories about things that my dad did to my mom sexually when I was a child, and it can definitely be very destructive to the children. So the emotional incest, using the children in between, we were definitely used as a weapon between my parents when my mom decided to leave. My dad threatened that he would take us and my mom would never see us again. And so that's often very common. And like I said, 60 to 70% of offenders will get children in a custody battle, mostly because of the intensity of the abuse that's happened to her. When she presents before a court, she looks crazy. because of the emotional impact that the abuse has had on her. And I've talked a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain, but she can't use the frontal cortex. She can't think logically and reasonably, and oftentimes because he's completely isolated her from all financial means, she doesn't have a place to live, she doesn't have a job, she doesn't have any skills, and so she can't support the children. So again, oftentimes, because of the power and control, she has a hard time even separating and having relationship with the children. So the children will be used to keep her in the relationship. And oftentimes, a lot of victims will not leave an abusive situation because of the children. And there are times where, especially where we come from at CASA, is that we don't interfere with that because she is potentially right. She could actually put her children in more danger by leaving the relationship than by staying. And again, most of child fatalities in Colorado Springs have been children in domestic violence situations where the offender killed the children to get to her.
Rearing healthy children. Mom loves dad, dad loves mom, children are safe. Family communicates family recreation. Individuality is encouraged. Feelings are allowed. I kind of camped right down that last sentence. Growing up, what I see in many families is that feelings aren't allowed. Only one person's feelings are allowed and respected and entertained. And one of the things that I really appreciate about my son, his wife, and their two years and 2-month-old child, Patrick Collin, is that there's a freedom. They express a lot more than we experienced growing up, openly. Both negative and positive feelings, and they're out there in the open, so that everybody knows kind of what's going on. And all kinds of feelings are allowed because they experience them. So there's a healthier environment there because feelings aren't suppressed. I can remember many, many times it's natural to be angry. I would say it's a God-given emotion to be angry, but so often being told, Mike, or even my brother, if you're angry, the parent is angrier. They have more right to be angry because of what has happened and taken place. And so a lack of respect, a lack of appreciating the fact that we all go through a variety of emotions.
I would say, from my perspective, anger was definitely not allowed in our family. You are not allowed to show negative emotions. And it was actually not until my master's in counseling program, and I'm sitting with my counseling team, and I'm basically sharing my history and my family, and this is before the time I actually knew it was domestic violence. I didn't even know it. And I'm sitting there sharing, and they're sitting there saying, Shirley, you're so cognitive. You don't show any negative emotion when you talk about your family. And I'm like, well, I don't feel any negative emotion. And it actually took me about 3 years before I actually started to feel the anger and the hurt and the fear for the first time in my life, because I got so good as a child at learning how to shut down and stop negative emotions. I probably cried in front of people for the first time in my life about 2 or 3 years ago. I did not cry in front of people, and it actually makes me extremely functional and good in crisis situations because my emotions are so under control. It's made me good for my job, I'm not going to lie, because in a crisis situation, I am as calm as a cucumber. You can get me in a high emotional environment, and I can be completely calm. But I had to as a child because negative emotions and anger were not allowed. Now again, my father could have all the negative emotions that he wanted, and actually my mom kind of did too. But we were not allowed to have the negative emotions, and so I've learned how to stop them, and I can be really, really good at it. And it's taken a lot of work for me to be able to actually express negative emotion, express anger, express hurt. It's still sometimes a challenge for me, but.
Me too. I love stuff emotions.
The next book is actually the responsibility of use, and that again is him making her responsible for everything in his life. Everything is her fault. She's responsible for all the emotions. She's responsible for all the children's behavior problems. She's responsible for everything. It's always her fault, and oftentimes she'll take the responsibility.
Appropriate communication. All family members have a right of expression, the ability to talk and to know that you are being heard, understanding the importance of tone of voice and body language in expression and listening skills. I wish I could show you a 9-minute video that I have in my office that I frequently show couples, because a lot of what I do is teaching communication skills at times. And in this 9-minute video, this couple talk about and solve a problem that neither one of them knew how the other person really thought and felt about the problem. Many times in those 9 minutes, you'll see an expression go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't understand that. Oh, I didn't get that. And it's like they totally respect each other in such a way that they draw each other into the process so that they understand really what's going on. And in 9 minutes can talk about it respectfully, even with some emotions. There's lots of body language that goes on that you can see, and it's not done perfectly, but they successfully talk about the problem, bring it to a conclusion in which they both feel like it's a win-win. And that is possible in communication, but only if you respect the feelings and the thoughts of other people. Much of research done in the area of communication would teach that there are 4 things that couples and families negatively do that impact their communication process. Number 1 is the obvious one: fight, scream, yell, and call names. Number 2 is what Charity shared earlier. It's going into silence and withdrawing and using that to punish. The third thing is that we dismiss, belittle, and discount what the other person thinks and feels. That's stupid. Nobody ever thinks that way. That's dumb. I never felt that way before. The process in communication is to understand the other person. It's not really to solve the problem. It's to, when you can come to a place and you say, I think you get me. Jan, I think you understand how I really think and feel about this issue, and she can say the same thing, then we can go into a problem resolution. The fourth is one that we're not aware of but happens all the time. And that is, we read something into what the person is saying that they never intended. So when I come home, this is just hypothetical, this I don't think has ever happened. When I come home and I'm tired and Jan's fixing dinner, and I say, you know, I'm going to lay down on the couch for a few minutes while you're finishing up dinner, she could, and I've heard people do this, interpret and go, oh, you don't really like spending time with me, do you? In other words, we take the person's words and we take them 10 yards further. We spin it and we put our interpretation on it, and it's very, very destructive. You have to check those things out. Check out your assumptions to make sure if they're true or not true.
The next one is sexual abuse, and this is where one partner is sometimes forcing their partner to do bizarre or just sexual acts that that person would not want to do or choose to do, treating her like an object, using sex as a weapon, waking her up in the middle of the night and forcing her to have sex. One of the things that I will tell you too is typically with when there's power and control in relationships, one thing to just kind of be cautious with, and even, you know, for teenagers and young adults too, is that oftentimes with abusive relationships, he is pushing the relationship harder and faster than typically the other person is ready and willing to go. And so sex usually comes into play very quickly in these types of relationships, even in like teen and young adult years, that person is pressuring that person to have sex right away. And typically there's a lot of love at first sight, I've never met anyone like you, and they really move the relationship very quickly. It's not uncommon for a lot of domestic violence relationships to only be like a 6-month time span before they're married. So oftentimes the abuser is very quick in the relationship, trying to get it to move faster, a lot quicker. But again, the sexual abuse is very high in these types of relationships.
Equitable responsibilities, sharing tasks, developing mutually enjoyable activities, accessible to help when needed, commitment to specific share times. Jan and I have a very, very traditional relationship. For most of our married lives, 37 years, I've been the single wage earner, and Jan has been the person who's taken care of the home and done an amazing job. I could never, ever do what I do without Jan doing what she does. See, I have maybe cooked 6 times in our married life. There's a very definite line between the things and roles that we do. There is, and I believe has to be, a lot of flexibility because most people don't have the advantage of having that in their lives. So when there are two wage earners in a home, to me, there's no question that the responsibilities need to be divvied up in a way that they agree upon so that both people are participating. Too often in my own counseling sessions, I hear these situations where married couples, both working, but still the woman is working when she comes home. Her job never, ever ends. And the guy is sitting on the couch, watching a TV program, football, or whatever. And it really is not equitable and needs to be addressed.
The next one is spiritual abuse, and this is when someone is using and twisting scripture to perpetrate the power and control. So using headship, using submission, using words like obey to make sure that that person, that he's basically saying, God is on my side and I have the right to control you, and you have to do anything and everything I say and what I want, and basically treat that person as a slave because they believe, and honestly they typically believe, that God has given them that right, which, as Mike is going to get into, we completely disagree with and don't believe that that's what true biblical submission is. But I can tell you, one of the last things that my ex-fiance told me before we ended the relationship is, he's like, you will not obey me. You do not submit to me. And that, I mean, he would accuse me of that. And I remember looking at him the first time he said that to me, and he's like, you don't obey me. And I looked at him and I said, I am not your dog. And thankfully, again, I had some people in my life that were very instrumental in telling me, because I did wrestle with it. After, growing up with a father that used that, because again, my dad was a leader in the church, and I actually honestly believed that that's what headship and submission meant. And so there was a lot of, I kind of thought that that was true. And I had some people in my life, some pastors and some family friends that spoke into my life and said, this is not what that means. That does not mean that a man gets to completely wipe away your total identity and who you are and what you think and what you want for your life. And that that's not what that means. And so I'm thankful that I have those people.
Susan?
My husband said a couple of weeks ago, we were with a group of people, and he said, and this had come up, and he said, God didn't command us in His Word for wives to obey their husbands. He commanded children to, but He wants us wives to cooperate with our husbands. And that really ministered to a bunch of us. So that was a good way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have actually had people come into my office, men come into my office with their wives, with the family Bible under their arm. I'm serious. I mean, like these big things you put on tables and display. And turn to Ephesians 5 and say, we would not have any problems if my wife would just submit to me. Now, it is interesting. In fact, I had a situation, co-therapy situation, in which when we finally got to the bottom issue, what was the man's issue? He said, everything would be fine in our home if she would just call me Lord. It is interesting in Ephesians 5, when Paul is talking, he doesn't tell the husband to instruct his wife to submit. He doesn't tell the wife to respect her husband. He gives that command to you, and it's your responsibility. It's not for you to take up the other person's responsibility and say, you owe me, you need to submit, or you need to respect. It's just a misuse of Scripture in that sense. I hope we have the time. When I sat down to prepare for a lesson on submission, there's no way you can do that in less than 20 hours. It covers so many different areas. But I will make a book recommendation at the end of our presentation this morning that I think would be very helpful. And I'll hopefully get to some, how I think it relates to the church and the whole issue of submission.
I love that cooperation as opposed to submission. Cooperation, a equal partnership.
Yeah, it is interesting because that section of Scripture, Paul clearly says, therefore submit one to another. It's not a singular activity. It's not demanded. Is it my turn?
I think it's my turn. Using male privilege.
One of the things that's interesting in that passage in Ephesians
Jan was just sharing that a fruit of the Spirit is that cooperation, mutual submission to one another. That's the intent of the passage in Galatians 5. Well, Ephesians 5 is the husband and wife, and Galatians 5 is the fruit of the Spirit. I thought that's what you were referring to. Okay. She's combining them both. She can do that.
So using male privilege, treating her like a servant, she's a slave, and the children are a slave in their own home, acting like the master of the castle. He is the one that makes all the decisions.
Okay. Healthy sexual relationship, I could go on for hours about this. Communicating with each other about needs, preferences, or desires, respecting each other's inhibitions because of previous traumas. That is like so incredibly important. If there's been trauma, there are certain things of like even smells, situations in which rooms are set up, certain mannerisms, facial expressions that will provoke and trigger a person who's been through trauma. You have to know those things and be able to respect those things. But I would also say on top of that, healthy sexual relationships, very few people know in married life how to communicate their need and desire for sexual experience. There's more of that. Why didn't you pick up the fact that I touched you with my elbow? Why didn't you see that that's the way that I glanced at you? Why didn't you understand that this is the right... There's never really, or very seldom, do I see people clearly communicating openly, without inhibition, what their needs and desires are. And that's a tremendous task, I think, that we have as couples to grow in, because of all that's been put upon us through a culture that has distorted sexual expression.
The next one is the physical abuse, so that's kicking, shoving, hitting, punching, scratching, shoving, slapping, using weapons, tripping, all of those types of things, so all the physical piece of it. I will tell you, just as kind of warning signs, if you have ever got a person who has put their hands on another person's throat, the chances of them actually killing that person are high. If someone's willing to go to the point of choking or strangulation, that is a high lethality situation. So if anybody ever tells you that they've had a partner in their past put their hands on their throat, that person's ability to kill that person is very, very high.
Can you describe a woman that keeps going back to abusive relationships, like one to another to another?
Could you repeat that?
So basically the question is just describing the person who goes back to relationships, abusive relationships over and over again. Typically, in all honesty, most of them had it in their childhood, and that's what they think is normal. So oftentimes, again, like for my situation too, I know that I have, and it's something that's still being developed, and I still have a hard time. There is, most people in general that are not born in abusive homes or abusive situations have kind of a warning system. There's something in their spirit when they're around someone that says, hey, something's not right about this person. They have like an internal red flag, an internal warning system, and so they just kind of immediately push away from those type of people. I don't have that. And I've never had it, and it's something that I'm having to learn how to develop. Because of the abuse in my home, that warning red flag system is completely non-existent. So I've actually struggled in relationships with males. And the other piece of it too is that, again, oftentimes it's so normalized and they think that they deserve it. I kind of lost my train of thought, so I might have to come back in just a second. Go ahead and I'll remember it.
Do you want to repeat what you were saying?
Well, I always wonder how the relationship of love, when they're weird, from that situation, things have changed. I love him, and
I've got my thought back. Basically, when you are raised in that type of home, love and hate are very mixed. And so your idea of what love is, especially if you were a woman who was raised in an abusive home or raised with an emotionally distant father, oftentimes because love was so defined differently, that when you get in an adult relationship, what we normally think of love and hate, they don't see it the same way. You have a different interpretation and a different perspective. And the other piece of it too is that the offender is not all evil. They are not pure evil all the time. My father was not. There was times when my father was actually a very good and loving father, but then there were other times when he was not, and it is so confusing for that person. And so their definition of what is love and what is a good relationship is so twisted in their minds because it's been so warped from an early age.
So is it kind of like love is a conditional thing, and it's based on the interpretation of the abuser, so it would have this first sense of what's good and what's abusive.
Yeah.
Not being able to distinguish one from the other, right?
Yeah, so basically her comment and question was that because, the love is defined by the abuser, that it can be confusing and it increases that warped sense of what is love.
Sometimes to feel the pain, you feel like you're alive.
Feeling the pain makes them feel alive. And again, we also have a media that highlights that what love is violence. I mean, if you've seen some of the music videos, some of the stuff that has been being put out there, where especially teenagers, they have this very warped concept of what love is because of the music that is out there, because of the music videos that are putting out there, where it highlights, if you are really passionate, that it's this mix of love and hate. You fight and then you make love, and you fight and you make love, and that's what love and passion is. And that's what we're promoting to our teenagers in movies and books and magazines and music videos and music, and it is distorting this younger culture's idea of what love and relationship is all about. And so the education piece here is huge.
It also has a lot to do with expectation, worth, and value. If the message has been consistently throughout a person's life that they don't have worth and value, they actually get to a point of believing a message inside that I don't deserve anything better. Yes, I know there could be something better out there, but I really don't deserve it, so I keep going back to what I know best. It's sort of like the reverse of a princess mentality. We know that people can get used to being served and treated well, and then they expect, well, I just expect that you should be doing these things for me. In the same way, you can have the reverse of that, where a person just expects that they should be treated poorly, even though they know in their mind, know from objective truth that they shouldn't. That's their experience.
I just wanted to say that this behavior is not restricted to women alone, but men also, especially if they're abusive moms, go from abusive relationship to abusive relationship.
That is very true. And his point was that oftentimes men, especially if they've been raised in an abusive home and have an abusive mother, that they also go from abusive relationship to abusive relationship. And I will...
Sorry, this is an awesome time for questions, but let's hold the questions for just a minute. Let them finish up with these last couple of things so that we can have this on video and people after us can hear the rest of the bits and points, the points that they're going to make, okay? You did have something else to say, is that right?
I did. Just one more.
Okay.
So your turn.
I've got one more, you've got one more, so... the next one is stalking. So this is basically when the offender will follow and track the person. Stalking has increased because of the use of GPS, tracking devices that people can put on people's phones, cars. This is becoming a major problem in high schools and in college campuses as well. Stalking has increased significantly. And again, one thing that I want to point out is just, if there is an abusive relationship, just because the relationship ends does not mean that the abuse will end. Oftentimes, if there is a separation that happens, the offender in that relationship will continue to stalk and send gifts and all kinds of things to the person's work, or stalking is a significant issue in abusive relationships. And again, just because a relationship ends does not mean that the abuse will end.
My last one is spiritual development, personal relationship with God, family activities and expressions, individual worship, spiritual training for children. What I would say about that is we need to be able to trust Jesus and the other person. We often want to put our spiritual perspective, our beliefs, our style of worship, even what we do in terms of church attendance, onto another person because God has led us this way. I have this basic prescription for marriage. If I have a problem and my wife doesn't have the problem, or reverse, if she has a problem and I don't have a problem, we have a problem. We have to share the problem. I would say that, and I've seen this too many times, a couple being in a particular church or spiritual environment where one person is totally uncomfortable with it, and the other person is enforcing their will on them, saying, I really believe God wants us here. I think in that situation, if there isn't total agreement about where you're being spiritually fed, you shouldn't be there. You should be backing up and saying, we need to find where it is that we both feel comfortable, both feel like we're being fed, and both feel like our children can be nourished. But ultimately, trusting Jesus and the other person, believing that he can work his program, and it may look different than his program for you, is a vital place for health and spiritual development.
So, could I interrupt you real quick, Glenn?
You're going to?
I'm going to, like it or not, I'm sorry. So it's, excuse me. Goodness, it's 20 minutes past right now. So if you have children to pick up, you're welcome to go ahead and pick up the children. Will you guys stay for 10 minutes or so and answer questions? They're going to keep their microphones on. They're going to entertain questions for the next 10 or so minutes. So if you need to go pick up kids, go ahead and go pick up kids. We're finished as a class, and they're going to answer questions. And thank you so much, Charity and Mike, for doing this. I appreciate it.
The question is,
because we're recording this on video, if you could repeat the question, that'd be great.
the question is, are restraining orders effective?
I will go ahead and answer that one since I work with that. Yes and no. Restraining orders is just a piece of paper. If someone is intending to abuse someone, a piece of paper is not going to stop them. However, from a legal aspect, if this person has violated a restraining order over and over again, the chances of him actually getting a conviction and actually being put in jail is higher if there is a restraining order in place. So if she is willing to follow through with the prosecution of the case, that restraining order and his violation of the restraining order is significant in the legal process. However, a restraining order does not keep an abuser from stalking or abusing that person.
And what frequently happens, if the person who obtained the restraining order is truly a codependent personality, they transgress the restraining order themselves.
And
they call,
frequently.
they contact, they email, they text, and then can later on use that against the other person if that person responds.
Yes.
Here first.
Has the law changed about issuing restraining orders? An experience I had many years ago was, well, maybe 10 years ago, was that Tesla wasn't able to even put in a request for the restraining order unless there was actual physical violence that the victim would agree could happen.
There does have to be a significant, their question is, has the law changed around obtaining restraining orders, and had a situation in Tesla where someone wasn't able to get a restraining order? It's actually tested. It's not determined who gets a restraining order. It is by a court judge. It is dependent on the discretion of the court judge. So basically, in all honesty, I'm actually fighting the judicial system quite a bit right now because we have some judges that are actually very supportive and understand domestic violence, and we have some judges that are absolutely ignorant and have no concept of victims' rights whatsoever. So it honestly depends on the judge that's involved in hearing the case. The legal standard is that there has to be some threat or fear of a threat.
Over here.
Quick question and comment. First of all, first thing, I'm just seeing a correlation, a connection between bullying. Can you guys talk about that also as a strategy, as a counseling strategy, if the person is having bullied in the past, and you guys personally experiencing with that, is it a good strategy, or I understand if the person that is bullied is tendency to have domestic violence, but it doesn't appear you guys talking.
So as first question is basically the relationship between bullying and domestic violence and just what you do with that. And yes, there is frequently, if there is bullying that is happening, oftentimes the offender is being raised in a home where there is domestic violence or there is violence impact. It is one of those things where typically the bully needs individual counseling. They need someone to actually work them through what is going on in their home life and their personal life, because bullying is a way of gaining power and control. So typically the person who is the bully is experiencing situations where they feel powerless, where they feel helpless, where they feel out of control. This is a major problem that's happening in schools. But part of the problem is, in general, the school district is not looking at what's going on in the home. They're just trying to focus on the behaviors, and if you just focus on the behaviors in themselves and try to get the behaviors to stop by using power and control, by using punishment, you're not going to get those behaviors to stop. So you actually have to go into the home and find out what's going on in the home, and you have to have counseling for the entire family in order to actually get bullying behavior to stop.
And the whole experience of girls bullying other girls has grown exponentially.
Yes.
Question?
I wanted to respond to that fellow over there with his question. Oftentimes, codependency, emotional dependency, because they feed off of each other, and they think it's love, and you mentioned value and stuff. That's why a person keeps returning, because they think that's love, and it's the dysfunction, and they feed off of each other, and that's oftentimes why they keep going back. And I know a lot of people here are familiar with that term, emotional dependency, where the dysfunction and the ungodliness connects to each other. And so I just thought that might shed a little more light into this question, why the woman keeps going back. She's getting her value, even though it's in a negative way. For her, it's a twisted affirmation and twisted what love is, and acceptance.
Yeah, that's a very deep and complex level of difficult to understand, but very true, that it often feels like love, because that's been the only experience. It's almost like programmed to do that. And that's deep and very involved and hard to disentangle. Good point. And I just want to emphasize a great point made here too, that the whole thing is spiritual community, because people who are being abused and people who question themselves don't tend to share those things openly. So being in a secure, safe environment with people that you know well, very, very important. In fact, there's a book that I like to recommend that talks about spiritual adoption, which is basically being in a healthy community of people and the necessity of that.
And I would say in general too, there's some quotes out there that basically say neutrality only helps the oppressor, never the victim, and being silent only helps the tormentor and never the tormented. So silence and neutrality cannot exist when there's abuse happening. And you do have to have a community that's willing to come alongside and support and say this behavior is not okay. Because doing nothing actually helps the abuser and the oppressor and not ever the victim. And it is true that it often takes the victim about 10 times before they'll actually tell someone what's actually going on. So you may be meeting with someone and it can be, you've met with them 10 times before they've ever shared any hint that there is abuse happening in the home. It is not something easy to share because of the stereotypes and the fear of what people might blame them or accuse them, and that has happened for most victims at some point or another. When they have tried to share what is going on, someone either minimized it or thought it was a communication issue or blamed them or tried to give them advice on how to be a better wife so that it wouldn't happen. Most victims have experienced some type of that reaction whenever they have gone to someone for help. So victims are very, very fearful, especially in the church, because of some of these headship and submission and how is the church going to respond if I tell them what's going on. Most victims believe that the church is going to support the abuser and not the victim.
Last question.
Kind of along those lines, I have a friend thought that she had communicated a whole bunch of stuff that it was, I didn't realize until later that she was like, Mary, do you really that I can keep you? Hell, how did I get back? And she's like, well, you told me your son was crazy with us. And it was like, well, it was because my son has food allergies and has in a joking way, I understood this threatening towards me of you. And I was supposed to extrapolate that to what we should do. But she had shared some things that if I were like insightful at that time, I would have picked up what it is as, like things that we need to deal with.
And again, sometimes the abuse it can be that subtle. It can be something that they can actually say in public to their victim that sounds to other people like not that big of a deal, but there's an implied intention in it. And so, they feel the threat and the abuse coming in public situations where there's church members all around, and most people, because they don't understand domestic violence and the power and control involved with it, they don't pick up on it. And again, we're not necessarily wired to pick up on abuse. We're wired to believe that most people are good and that we want to see the best in people. And so we're not necessarily wired to pick up on that charming, engaging, fun-loving guy, or even that quiet, timid, seems like he can never hurt a fly. We're not in tune to pick up on that person could be abusive. We're intent and inclined to believe that that person is exactly who they present to be. And so, they can publicly do something to the victim in front of other people and nobody is the lesser. And he's basically telling her that, see, everybody saw it, nobody did anything. Nobody's going to believe you.
Wow, this has been amazing. Sorry? Yes, I'd love to. Thank you so much, Mike and Charity. This has been amazing. And we will... We will make sure that we all know how to... If you guys have questions that you want to pass on to Mike and Charity, please send them to myself or Jeff, or write them on the green comment cards, and we'll be sure to get you answers for those as well. So let me close and send us to church. Father, in the name of Jesus, I thank you so much, Lord, for the amazing wisdom, Lord, that we have heard this afternoon from Charity and from Mike, Father. And I pray right now, Lord, that in each of our lives, Lord, that we would be more and more in tune with your Holy Spirit so that we can discern what is going on around us, Father. Help us, Lord, first of all, to keep these things, these unhealthy behaviors out of our life and to bring the healthy behaviors into our life, Lord. And then help us, Father, to discern what's happening in the people around us as we counsel, as we speak with friends, as we talk with relatives and nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters. Help us, Father, to discern what's going on, and Lord, to be a help there. Guide us in the right things to do in helping in that situation, Father. Most of all, Lord, we want to submit to you, Father, and come before you and hear your voice and know what direction you want us to go. I thank you again, Lord, and I pray that you bless Mike and Charity, and that you would watch over them, and that you'd watch over each of us, Father, so we can be a blessing to others. In Jesus' name.